Hello everyone, welcome back. So this is chapter 7. So starting in this chapter, we are going to start looking into some of the macroeconomic topics. So more specifically, we're going to talk about the measurements of different variables in the macroeconomic study. So unlike the very first few chapters that we cover most of the fundamental economic theories, we are going to more focusing on the macroeconomic variable study in chapter 7 and chapter 8. And then we will talk about some of the um, uh, theoretical backgrounds of the theories in chapter 10 and 11 and 12. So in the study of economics, we have many things that we can measure. And in chapter 7, we're going to be more focusing on the study of GDP and also price levels. So in this chapter, we're going to break it down to two sections in the video lecture. So the first section is going to be more focusing on explaining how we measure the domestic products of a country or an economy, and how different measurements of this domestic product is defined. And then in the next part of chapter 7 lecture videos, we're going to cover the price index definitions, how we are tracking prices in the economy, and what are the different ways to track price levels in the economy. So when we start thinking about the macroeconomic study, we want to refer back to the simple circular flow diagrams that we studied in chapter 2 and extend that into this more complex but more closer to how our economy works. So in the previous models, we basically having the assumptions that the economy only has households and firms interact with each other. And indeed, in the reality, we have more than just the firms and the households. And in this diagram here, you can see the relationship between four different agencies in an economy and how they are interacting with each other in three different marketplaces. So the first two that we would like to review in this diagram are the households and the firms. And as we study in chapter 2, we already know that the firms will pay their money into the factor markets in terms of wages, profit, interest, and rent into the factor market to get what they want to produce the goods and services. And this money will float into the pockets of the households as a wage, profits, interest, and rent. And obviously, households like us, we receive the money from our work or maybe our businesses. We will spend the money back into the economy to buy goods and services, and we call this consumer spending. And ultimately, this money will flow back into the firm because we pay the money for the goods and services, and money will ultimately go back to the firms as the amounts of money that the firms created in the economy. And we call this the gross domestic product. Of course, we can extend this study here a little bit further from our perspective as a household. And most of you recognize that the money that we earn generally will have a portions going into the hands of the government, and we call this the tax payments. Right? So taxes will be going into the government's pockets, and governments will spend that money to buy goods and services so that they can provide the public services to the general public. And we call this the government purchase or the government spending. Well, not only just that, the government also will sometimes transfer the payment back into our pockets. So you can simply think about scenarios like when government making a government transfer payment to some unemployed populations, right? So we do have unemployment insurance covering people who lost their job temporarily and they need to have the money to survive. So that kind of transfer is not a spending indeed, but it's more like a transfer payment that the government making the money back into our pockets in different ways. And thinking more about ourselves, not only we pay tax and we spend money to buy goods and services, but we also sometimes have some leftover. And this leftover will usually goes into the financial markets. And most of the time, we think of those money that we don't spend or leftover saving. So the private saving here will go directly into the financial markets like banks, um, assets payments or funds and bonds and different types of financial assets that you would interact in the financial market with different agencies. So this kind of private saving, it's a big, huge chunk of amounts of money that goes into the financial market so that it can be actually goes into different ways. And of course, when bank receive your money, they won't just put it into the bank vault and just let it sit still in the bank. It has to start using your money to generate more money. And most of the time, banks will make money by borrowing it or lending to some other agencies in the economy. So one of the bigger agencies in the economy who would usually borrow money from the financial markets, surprisingly, is the government, right? It's particularly in the U.S. In the U.S., we do have a U.S. government that usually borrow money from the financial market from our private savings. The way how they did it usually is through a specific types of bonds, right? So I think many of you might have heard about the term treasury bonds, right? So the treasuries of the United States, they will issue a note and saying that, well, if you buy this notes today and later we will pay you back with your money plus some interest payments, right? So directly getting the money assets from the private households. And of course, the largest borrower in the economy is the firm, right? Because firms needs the money to make profits, right? So they have to buy different tools and invest into different projects. So they are usually the largest borrower in the economy. That will get the money from the financial markets and then so that they can actually expand their operations. So thinking about firms, they are borrowing the money from the financial markets. They also will pay money not into just the factor market, but they will basically invest those money into like future developments of the new products or maybe having a new facility built for future productions. So those kind of spending, we don't count them as a spending into the factor market, but we actually count them as an investment spending where firms are paying money to other firms in the economy for the developments of their future expansions. So this is kind of like a domestic flow of assets. And to expand that idea further, we have the third agents, which is everyone else outside of our economy domestically, right? So anyone from Japan or Italy or maybe French, they might be able to interact with our economy as well, but not directly as the households in the United States, right? So the way how they are interacting with our economy is through uh, either import exports or maybe they are through our financial markets. So imagine when we are buying stuff from, let's say, I don't know, well, Germany, right? A car from produced in Germany. And this is immediately and imports that we bring the car from Germany to the United States, and the money that we use to buy the car will be the money floating out of our economy. And when someone in Japan is buying an iPhone from the United States, right? So this is basically we shipping out our phone that produced domestically, even though iPhone is not produced domestically in the United States, but consider that as a products that we produce here. And then we ship the phone out, and then the money will get into our economy to buy that phone. So this is a very simple concept of import-export, how the rest of the world interact with our domestic economy. On the other hand, we can also think about the interaction can happen in financial markets. Like someone maybe in Singapore, they want to invest their money into buying the stock of Tesla, right? So they can actually paying the money in the United States and buying the stock of the Tesla and setting up their account here. Same, it's also true, someone in the United States who might want to invest to buy a government bonds issued by, let's say, the governments of China or maybe Japan, right? So they can actually set up their account overseas and start making the exchange so that they can use the local currency to buy those bonds and financial assets that they want overseas. So you can think about this money can also be floating out and in um, with the rest of the world and how we are interacting with them can be many different ways to do it. So this is a very general idea about how the economy actually works in general. So keep in mind, this is a very important model for everyone here to study before they are stepping into the more theoretical ideas of how the macroeconomy works as generals, because only you can keep this concept in mind, then you can think about how this spendings might actually make sense in our later topics when we talk about the gross domestic product. So now we have some good idea about how the flow of these financial assets in our economy. Then we can actually talk about what is the most important things to study in economics, right? Or macroeconomics in general. So one of the biggest topics to study in macroeconomics is the study of business cycle. So we want to actually having a systematic way to study why sometimes the economy going up and sometimes going down. And from the history, we know for sure that there is no one economy can like always go up or always go down, right? So there will always be some sort of like cycle that we can study, and we want to know the reasons, right? So why it happens and how can we um, make the downturns to be less severe if that happens in our economy, right? And how we are actually controlling the expansions and not having the economy to run too fast. So how do we know if the economy is actually expanding or getting into recessions? So there are several ways to think about this problem. One is basically think about how much goods and services are produced in the economy, and we think that, well, the more we produce and provide it in the economy, it's the better we are, right? So the more goods and services we can enjoy. Another way to think about this is to think about the level of employment in the economy, right? When everyone actually have a jobs and they have stable incomes, they have good enough income to support their spending in the economy, that is a good sign, right? And also, another way to think about the cycle is the amounts of dollar that we spend on goods and services. Um, so thinking about the total amounts of goods and services that we have in the economy might not be totally true, because if we produce 100 units of the product, but people can only afford to buy 10 in general, obviously it's not a good sign, right? So therefore, the price level, right, in the economy is also important, and everyone here might already have experience a very realistic shocks of the inflations in the past few years, right? So prices has been consistently going up, and it makes things much less affordable in our life, and the income and salary is not rising as fast as the price level of the general goods and services. So that kind of scenarios that we also want to consider in the study of macroeconomic as well. And of course, the most fundamental way to think about how well the economy is, or the wellness of the economy, is to basically just go out there and ask everyone uh, in a standard survey and say, well, do you think you are doing better than yesterday or maybe last year, right? Then we can get a sense of like whether we are actually improving or not. But obviously, well, all of this here that we're suggesting are basically just for now, it's just a very simple ideas, right? So we're not saying that one or the other is better than the other ones, but you can think about what can be measured and what is possible to measure. Then we can think about like what are the possible solutions to track the wellness of the economy. And obviously, the last one here is kind of out of the ordinary because, well, there's no way for us to track everyone's wellness in the economy every day and ask them to rate their wellness, right, in the economy every day or every month or even every year. So it's not even possible, right, to do it. All right, so back to the the things that we discussed earlier. So think about the first one, right? First, and we want to actually track how much goods and services are available in the economy or produced it. We can actually think about how we can measure that. And there is obviously measurements that we can actually study immediately in this chapter, which is called the gross domestic products. The GDP, right, is a term that you usually hear from the newspaper or the online news. So GDP basically measure the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country within a period of time. Right? So that's a very clean, simple definitions of GDP. Right? So it's market value of the goods and services, and it only counts what we call the final goods and services, and it only measures the values produced within the country border and also within a specific time period. So we're not talking about a long time periods measurement, not cross-country values, and not every goods and services, right? So there's a very, very clear definitions of this. And GDP is measured using the market values, not quantity, right? So that's very important to keep in mind, right? So we are not talking about how many cars and how many cakes that we produce in the economy within a particular periods, but we are talking about the total market values of those goods and services. And also, it includes the final goods only, but not the intermediate goods. So the difference between the final goods and services and the intermediate goods and services is one, the final goods is the one that we consume and use as a household. And intermediate goods and services are usually the types of goods and services that is uh, basically purchased by firms or businesses so that they can actually add values on it and then making profits from the services. So you can think about easily, even just as simple as sugar, right? Sugar can be final goods or intermediate goods. So if we buy a pack of sugars from a supermarket and we use it to make cake and we eat the cake, right? So we consume the sugar ourselves, we pay the money, and that is considered to be final goods. And the reason is because we are not actually generating any additional profits from that cake. However, if a bakery will buy the same bag of sugars and they use the sugar to bake cookies and they sell the cookies in the market to generate profits. And in that case, the sugar that the bakery bought is considered to be the intermediate goods. And the simple concept here is actually quite intuitive because intermediate goods is basically an added values to the final goods in the final transaction in the economy. The cookie itself already contain the cost of the sugar. So if we are counting the value of the sugar that made cookie and sell it in the markets, we are literally double counting the values of the sugar itself. Right? So therefore, we only consider the market value of the final goods, but not anything that is going to be considered what we call the intermediate goods or services. So GDP includes only current productions. Right? So important, it has a particular periods of time that we study of a particular set of values in the markets. So when we talk about gross domestic product, we also want to pay a little bit more attention to different terminologies here. So in the later chapter discussions, or when you're reading your textbook, there might be some confusing terminologies here, and just want to bring it up first, and later you can actually dig into it a little bit more. So most of the time, we can generally divide this GDP terminology into these four big categories. Right? So the nominal GDP, which is the measure of the final output produced in the country. So this is basically the terms that we use to measure the current year's gross products, gross domestic products in the economy without adjusting any price level. Okay, so it's only counting one current year terms. Potential GDP, on the other hand, is the measure of the full employment level final output. And we are going to talk a little bit more about like what we mean by full employment in chapter 12. But you can consider the potential GDP is basically when all the prices and wages are flexible, right, to move around, and somehow we configure what we need to produce based on all this price and wages earned by people, and then there is a maximum level of output that the economy will produce at that flexibility of the price adjustments levels. So that's basically what we call the potential GDP. You can also think about this as like, okay, well, that's is the maximum amount of goods and services that we can possibly produce, right, in the economy, given that prices and wages are flexible to adjust at any time. Real GDP, on the other hand, is basically a gross domestic product values, but adjusted by the price level. So the nominal GDP and the real GDPs are the two that you don't want to mess up. And the nominal term is not adjusted by inflation or deflations. However, the real GDP, on the other hand, does adjust by the price level across different time periods. So it can be directly compared time to time for the real GDP, but however, the nominal GDP cannot be directly compared across time to time because it's not adjusted for price level. And the final terms here, per capita GDP, right? So it's basically the real GDP divided by the populations in the country. So on the other hand, you can think about the simple definition here is the GDP per person, right? How much each person on average earns in the economy. So these are the different terms that we are going to see over and over again in the study of these chapters and later on as well. So please spend some time to dig into them. Now we have talked about some of the most important things in of the study in the macroeconomic study. We can actually try to take a look at some of these uh, uh, measurements, right, over time. So this is basically a little bit outdated, but I think it's basically bring out the point of why the study of GDP is important, right? So this plot right here demonstrates three countries' economics conditions by the GDP values. So we have the blue lines right here is China, and the green line is the United States, and then the India is with yellow. And you can totally see how the growth of the United States has been almost always going up, right? Versus India is kind of like growing, but then growing much at a much slower rate. But on the other hand, if you look at China, China is kind of like a scenario between the two. It's not, it's growing very slow until the point where we have like 2004, 2005, we see the inflection points that it start triggering the growth of the China economy much faster, right, comparing to the other two economy. And then it's kind of like catching up with the United States too, right? And here we have another plot right here that's a little bit more updated, comparing um, the GDP within the Europe EU regions. Right? The largest economies in the EU regions are France, Germany, and United Kingdom. And you can see very close correlation between each of these country, right? So whenever it goes up, it goes well. The rest of the two country goes up, and whenever one country goes down, and then the other countries also kind of experience the same kind of effect. And in fact, this is pretty true, right, across different EU's countries as well, right? Not only just this three big economies, but it's also kind of the same happening in you can think about like Italy or maybe Spain or maybe Netherlands, right? So that's kind of like interesting to note, right? And if we switch to Asia, right? So this is kind of like speaking the story of Asia, how the Japan's compared to Korea and also Singapore. Singapore, it's a fairly developed country, but it's very small, and therefore you can see that well the GDP is kind of staying at the very low levels comparing to the other two. However, Korea is a very interesting one to study after the year of 2000 or a little bit earlier, like 1998 or so, because well, Korea has been a very underdeveloped countries back in the past, but after uh, the growth of the electronics and car industries in Korea, right? So Samsung and LGs and Kia's, right? So all this big industry in Korea, kind of like stepping into the international world, and also the K-pop business, also contributing to the worldwide phenomenons. It becomes a very fast-growing economy, right? One of the most successful story in the past 20 years in our histories. On the other hand, well, you can see Japan. Japan is looking quite awkward because after the year of 2000, 1995, 96, there is a big crash of the economy in Japan. And ever since that bank crisis in Japan, um, we call this a lost periods of the Japan's government, right, or the Japan economies, because you can literally see after 1995, we don't actually see any growth of Japan's, right, comparing to the rest of the economy. And you can see, well, there's up and down. There are some up and down, but it's definitely nothing like the United States or China, where it's always keeping up all the weights. And here, this is a interesting plot to talk about the South American countries. Right, so we have this measure of per capita GDP comparing three countries: Venezuela, Peru, and Colombia. They all looked very similar, right? So obviously they are very closely related to each other because the economy system or the economic relationships between these countries are very closely related to each other. However, you can see that there is a specific boost of Venezuela after the year 2012 and so, right? So you see the spike there. And after that, we don't actually have any data point from World Bank on this plot, but you can see this is a very obviously divergence, right, between Venezuela and Peru and Colombia. Venezuela, if everyone here knows that they are one of the largest uh, oil exporter from the Southern America continents. So I think during that time they will having this very high growth or expansions of their economy because of the surge of the oil prices during that time period. However, there is a very harsh conditions in Venezuela. If everyone notes here, is that they have been experiencing some very high inflations in the country, where the price of a bread can actually go from $1 to $100 in one night. Right, so not actually exaggerating here, but there are some very extreme changes or fluctuations of their currency within the countries in the past years. So there are some interesting story, of course, but the more we study and then the more we understand why this chart and why these measurements are important to us to understand the wellness of the economy, right? So it's not only just one dimension. There are many different things that we can actually study and evaluate, right? So in the previous slides, we have came across a few example of different countries compare across the GDP or per capita GDP. Now that we would like to go back a little bit on the concept of what we call the final goods and intermediate goods. So consider, right? So there is an example here where in a simple economy where we produce only four goods and services, shoes, clothes, concerts, paper, and books, right? Or actually, five goods and services, and assume all the paper in this economy is used in the productions of books, right? So we don't use paper at all, but we actually make book first before we are consuming the paper, right? So what is GDP in this economy for the year 2015, right? So in this case, we want to actually think about how we are counting which one is the final goods that we consume and which one is which one is the intermediate goods that we don't want to count towards our economy GDP. And obviously, in this case, if the paper is the one that we use them all to produce books, we want to count shoes, clothes, concerts, boats, but without the value of paper, right? So this is a very simple concept of final goods and intermediate goods and how we are actually making the calculations of this different product values in our economy. So what do we actually want to measure with GDP indeed, right? So in general, we want to actually measure the level of overall economic activities in the country using GDP. And also, GDP allow us to talk about the rate of change of this economic activities levels across time periods. Right? So we can talk about growth, declinings, then we talk about recessions, right? And we can actually make comparisons across time. And obviously, we want to also get the measurements so that we can take into account of different approaches, how we're measuring this kind of like activities or the wellness of the economy. So to get a better idea, we want to actually think about this problem in two ways. So one is that um, we want to think about the GDP as a forms of incomes that we receive from the firm, right? Remember, always firms produce something and they sell, they make money, and then ultimately the money will flow back into the factory markets and flow back to our hands. So this aggregates sum of money will ultimately flow into our hand as an income. And obviously, firm will sell the goods and services, and we are the one who spend the money. And therefore, you can think about the GDP as also a forms of expenditure in the economies. So based on how economists actually think about the flows and of the goods and services in the economy, we can now then think about the very conceptual definitions of GDP, or the measure of the general values of goods and services in the economy. So in the two approaches here, we are talking about there are the expenditure approach or income approach. So suppose you can think about in a one simple economy scenarios, Sam is the one who is always spending his income on hamburger. And in order to identify how much of the production took place in Sam's one-person economy, there are two ways to do it. So number one, we follow Sam's everywhere he goes, and whenever he purchases something, and obviously the only thing he is going to purchase in this economy is hamburger, we are going to collect the receipt of this purchase. So if Sam bought the hamburger in shop number one, well, we actually get that receipt. Shop number two, we get that receipt. Shop number three, we get that receipt. And then we collect all the receipts, and then we know how much Sam's actually total spends in the economy. And we call this an expenditure approach, how we measure the overall GDP in the economy. And obviously, the other way around is since Sam's will always spend all his income on buying hamburgers in the economy, so we don't actually have to follow him every day and everywhere, because we can simply just ask Sam, hey, how much did you make this month? And if we know it, then we know this has to be the total amount of money Sam is going to spend in buying the hamburgers in the economy. And we call this an income approach. So with this simple example, now then we can actually think about the definitions of GDP and how it ties with all the different types of spending in the economy. So talking about the expenditure approach here, we want to collect all the receipts that we spend in the economy, including not just the households, but also the spending from the firms, the spending from the government, and the spending from the rest of the world to buy our domestic products. And here, there are four agencies, and therefore we can term them into four different types of spending. And we call them consumptions, investment spending, the government spendings, and also the net exports. So keep in mind, these four different types of spendings associate with its agents, right? So consumption is related to household spending. Investment is tied with firm spending. Government spending, obviously, tied with the government. And the net export is the net of the spending from the outside world to buy our domestic products based on the import and export number. So the circular flow diagram assume consumers, firms, governments, and the rest of the world purchase these goods and services from the markets or an economy. And let's suppose there are two markets, a goods and services market and a factor market. So goods and services market is the market for the final use, and the factor market is the market for the inputs, right? The factors of production that produce the outputs of the services and goods. So in this case, households are paid for the input in the form of income, Y, and as a result, in this simple economy setup with two agencies, two markets, we can then define here Y, your total income, it's theoretically equals to the total spending from the households, the total spending from the firms, and the total spending by the governments and the net exports. And obviously, this total income is equal to the total expenditures in the economy, as we have discussed before, right? Then, therefore, the total expenditure should also be the sum of these consumptions, investment spending, government spending, and the net exports. So Y, the total income of the economy, equals to the total expenditures in the economy. And where does it come from? It's coming from C plus I plus G and plus NX. So the four components in the United States that add up to that total expenditures is it's quite complex, of course, within each of this category. We can break it down much further, right, into different sectors, types of services, different categories of goods and services, and different use cases, the terms of use. But the general idea is not to study the details of each of them, but it's just having a very high level theoretical concept of where spendings are coming from. Taking an example, in the United States, consumer spendings basically mostly spend on services. So the sum of spending on services are much greater. And then for a particular goods and services, services is greater. But the sum of spending on durable goods and non-durable goods are also are different categories that we can define. And obviously, most of the time you can think about durable goods are just like refrigerator, microwave, bicycles, right, that you can use for a long time. And non-durable goods are basically perishable goods. You can think about like the types of goods that you use at one time, like papers, right? So your printer, ink, that type of things that you can actually use up very quickly. On the other hand, for investments, so business fixed investments is usually the largest component of the investment spending in the United States. So we call this fixed investments, basically is the types of investments that it's already planned out by the firms and businesses. Purchase made by state and local governments are much larger than the purchase made by the federal governments, right? So even though federal governments overlook the whole country, but the sum of the state and local governments add up to be the bigger chunk of the money spent by the government in the United States. Imports in the United States are always, almost always, greater than exports. So if you look back in the history of the United States, 20 years, the imports value is always greater than the export value. So that means, well, our net exports are usually negative in the United States. So we have an example here that you can think about how each of this category add up to be a GDP, and how the definitions of this GDP is being defined as a total expenditure in the economy. Again, we're not taking this example as the real cases, but just want to kind of like give you an idea how granular details we can break it down into a different small category in each of this big category. So sometimes when we think about the way how we are calculating our GDP. Remember, we talked about how this intermediate goods and services are not being counted in the measure of GDP. So this is one of the way how we can explain why, right? So the value added method is the way how we can conceptually think about why we don't want to count those intermediate goods and services into our GDP because of the double counting problems. So in this simple case, you can think about how we are making a book and sell the book in the bookstore, right? So each of these services, right? So you can think about the firms here is basically the agents that provide a service to create that final book on the shelves. So we have the individual writer, they came up with the story, and the story, think about the story worth for like $5 of this book. And then we have the editors, right? So the editors provide a service to edit the book and the story to make sure it's readable, and it adds like two additional dollar value to the book. And then the publishers also provide a service to make the publication possible, and $2 value added. And then the printer to print the physical book out at another $1 value to it. And then finally, the bookstore will provide a shelves for the book to sit on the store so that people can see them and buy them. And then it adds another $3 values to the book value. And at the end, the book will be sell for $13 total in the economy. And as a result of that, this $13 is what we count as the final goods in the economy, but not the rest of the added values in each of this production process. So we talk so much about the GDP, and seems like GDP is a good measure of the overall activities in the economy. But unfortunately, there are some shortcoming or weakness of the measure of GDP. So number one, GDP does not count the household productions. So that means, well, anything that we do at home, right? Your mom cooking your breakfast, or your dad is doing the laundries, or you are cleaning up your rooms. All of these are valuable services, but none of them actually count toward GDP. And that's a big chunk of money measurements or market values there. Underground economy also it's not countable in the measure of GDP, unfortunately or fortunate. But consider countries like Chile, right? So Chile has a big underground economy for sure in the world, and majority of these illegal activities, right, in the economies are not measured in the GDP. And also, GDP does not reflect well-being as well as doing the survey, right, to everyone, right? So you can be very rich, but then you might not be feeling happy, right? And of course, the theory here is not saying that, well, the more you earn, you should be feeling more happy, but the measure here is saying, well, comparatively, if you have a better economic conditions than other agencies in the economy, then you should be right considered to be better well-being, right? But it's not necessarily the case, right? Obviously, and also GDP does not include leisure in the measurements, right? So you can easily consider country A, 10 people working 8 hours a day versus country B, 10 people working 16 hours a day, right? So obviously country B will have a higher level of GDP comparing to country A, but not necessarily means that, well, people are better living there, right? Um, Also, GDP does not adjust for pollutions or other negative effects of the productions, right? So there could be pollutions coming from the production firms, right, and generating this very toxic chemicals polluting the environments, right? So all these negative externalities are not being captured in the GDP figures. And also, they are not adjusted for changes in crimes or social problems in the economy. So that's also a big uh, 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 bias, right? In some of the, particularly in some of the developed countries, right, like the United States, crime and social problems are usually the bigger problems than the GDPs that we see growing every year. And also, GDP does not measure the equalities, right? So it measures how big the pie is, but then it doesn't really measures how the pie is actually divided up to every single one, right, in the economy. So that's being said. So GDP might not be the perfect measures for the overall well-being of the economy. However, uh, this is the best so far we can actually use. So we're gonna keep on that for now, and making our study based on the assumptions that, well, if someone or some family, right, or households has a higher level of incomes, we assume that is a sign, right? It's a signal that this family might be doing slightly better, right, than the ones actually next door that making maybe way less income, right, compared to them. So that's a general assumptions here, but it's not definitely not necessarily to be correct. All right, so that wrap up part one of this chapter, and hopefully you enjoy this sections here. And in part two, we are going to talk a little bit more about the price level topics and talk about different measurements of prices in the economy. And hopefully you will be able to pick up something interesting from there. All right, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.